Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the live talks by the United States Spiritist Federation every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Today, we have our friend Peter Hayes with us that we'll introduce shortly. But before we start, let's do our opening prayer, elevating our thoughts, asking for the inspiration and guidance of the spiritual benefactors, for their assistance, for our lecturer, for our studies, to allow us to be united in thought, in prayer, so we can all benefit from the teachings we're about to receive. We ask for the blessing and protection of all those that are struggling through this pandemic, that they may find faith, acceptance, resignation. We thank our Master Jesus for another opportunity of being reunited in His name. And it is with our hearts full of gratitude that we ask permission to start our meeting. So be it. So, welcome, Peter. Good morning. Thank you for being with us. Before I pass it over to you, a reminder, please post your questions on the chat. We'll have some time after the lecture to go over some of the Q&A. And let me formally introduce Peter Hayes. Peter Hayes is the president of the Spiritist group Love and Light in Newark, New Jersey, member of the Tri-State Spiritist Federation. He has done lectures on Spiritism within the United States, and he has participated in several U.S. Spiritist symposiums that are organized and sponsored every year by the United States Spiritist Federation. So, Peter, it is with you now.
Okay, thank you, Joel. I'd like to thank the Federation for having me as your guest. The book Action and Reaction, which is the 9th book in the Andre Louise series, was published in 1956. So we happen to be in the 65th anniversary of this book. The Andre Louise series, in case you're not familiar with it, focused a lot on life in the non-physical world, or the spirit world. And therefore, you could say that the Andre Louise series as a whole takes the content of the codification of Spiritism and gives a lot of vivid and specific examples and elaborates on the content of the spirit world. This book was psychographed by Chico Xavier. And in this book, it focuses on the subject of cause and effect. Andre Louise and his colleague, Hilario, go from No Salon into the lower zones. And they visit a place called the Mansion of Peace. And they're there because they want to study, to put on Andre's words, they want to study karma, or the law of cause and effect, the karma of the Hindus. So they use that word karma. And when they go to visit the Mansion of Peace, the Mansion of Peace is a place of refuge in the lower zones of the non-physical world, the spirit world, which is a rather dreary and unpleasant place. And the Mansion of Peace is compared to a place that actually exists called, they call it St. Bernard's Monastery, but it's really called Great St. Bernard's Pass Hospice. St. St. Bernard is located on the border of Italy and Switzerland, and it's been there for almost 1,000 years. And this place is a place of refuge. And when it was first built, it was there to be a place of refuge for travelers, to protect them from the snow, because it was very dangerous, but also there were a lot of robberies in that period as well. So it was a safe haven. And when Andre is describing what the Mansion of Peace is like in the lower zones, he says, just like St. Bernard is often surrounded by snow, the Mansion of Peace is frequently, almost always, surrounded by darkness. And they use the word Mansion of Peace to describe this place, but it's described as being more like a citadel, like a fortress. So one has to ask the question, why? Why is it like a fortress? Well, part of that has to do with what the purpose of the Mansion of Peace is. The Mansion of Peace is, there's a director for the Mansion of Peace named Druso, and his most trusted assistant is named Silas. And the purpose of Mansion of Peace is that it's there to help rescue spirits from the lower zones. And once they're brought into the Mansion of Peace as a place of refuge, they help these spirits to work on planning for their next incarnation into the physical world. So part of what the Mansion of Peace does is it's there to help spirits prepare for their next reincarnation. Or what the spirits will do is they may go to another part of the spirit world to receive further help, and then later on they'll reincarnate. Now, Andre, in looking at the Mansion of Peace, certainly describes it as a fortress, and there's a very good reason for it. And in the very beginning of this book, Andre and Ilario with Druso, the director of the mansion, and they're looking out the window from inside the Mansion of Peace out into what is nearby the Mansion of Peace. And there is this rather amazing sight that Andre witnesses. He describes it as it's like a raging windstorm, and there's this dark cloud substance, and it's similar to airborne dirt whirling violently in a strange vortex like a dark water spout. And from the monstrous body of the dreadful storm, human faces emerged, twisted in horror, cursing and moaning. They appeared suddenly, linked to each other like enormous chains of creatures holding on to each other in a moment of peril in their instinctive anxiety to prevail and survive. So the more Andre sees this sort of dust cloud outside the windows of the Mansion of Peace, they realize these are spirits interlocked to each other, and they're in complete and total agony. And Ilario and Andre, of course, are alarmed by this rather ghastly, dreary sight. And then Ilario asks a very obvious, perhaps and compassionate question. He says, look, the Mansion of Peace is this place of refuge. It's this place to receive these poor suffering spirits. Why don't you just open the doors and let them in? But Druso, the director of the sector, who's a very, very compassionate guy, really cares about what he does and cares about these spirits, his answer is revealing. He simply says that rescue is only truly meaningful for those who actually want to be rescued. So Druso is giving us a hint as to what they're up against. They are surrounded by spirits in the lower zones who are among the worst of the worst. These are spirits who have committed all kinds of crimes. And as far as why the Mansion of Peace doesn't just open up its doors, well, first of all, if they did, their entire purpose would be undermined. But Silas, the assistant to Druso, who is a character in this book who shows Andre and Ilario many examples of spirits going through cause and effect. Silas explains and elaborates a little later on in the book why the Mansion of Peace has to be set up the way that it is. He says there are thousands of spirits gathered here haphazardly, and he describes them as being victims of their own insane and gloomy thoughts. When they finally overcome their state of trouble or anguish, which may last for days, months, or years, they are brought into our institute, which as much as possible avoids opening itself to minds that are still completely entrenched in constant rebelliousness. So Druso said, rescue is only good for those who want to be rescued. And Silas is saying that these are individuals who are trapped in their own crazy thoughts or repetitive, obsessive, compulsive thoughts, which is a major theme in this book. And more importantly, perhaps, is that they simply don't want to change because they're not ready to change. And that's what it means when they say that they're entrenched in constant rebellions. We cannot help anybody who doesn't really want to receive help. And so this is another reason why the Mansion of Peace doesn't just open up its doors and they have protection. At the same time, this explanation is offered to us at a moment where Silas is explaining that they go out and they try to help some of these spirits from a distance, but they still need to protect the integrity of the Mansion of Peace and its important activities. Despite what they're up against, because let's face it, the Mansion of Peace is right on the front lines. I mean, No Solar is a spirit colony, and No Solar, I'm referring to the first book of the Andre Louis series. No Solar is a spirit colony that's just above the city of Rio, what we're told, and it's in a fairly pleasant place in the spirit world, relatively speaking, but it's just a little bit above the lower zones. The Mansion of Peace is in the lower zones. So they're kind of, not only are they on the front line, but you could even go so far as to say they're kind of like the Marines a little bit. They are surrounded by these spirits that are very disturbed. Spirits that would love to come into the mansion and completely undermine the place. But the good news is that there are spirits that do want to receive help. And there's an example of a character named Antonio Olympio, who was introduced in chapter 3 of the book. Antonio Olympio is brought in on a stretcher. And when Andre sees Antonio, he really is astounded and surprised because Antonio...
Peter.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but the sound is not very good. We need to try something different.
Okay.
Can you try to do without the headphones for us to see how it works?
Okay, let me try it. Can you hear me any better now?
I think so.
How's this if I talk?
I'm not sure it makes. Yeah, well, let's try this way, Peter.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay. So, one moment. Antonio Olympio is brought in, and when Andre looks at Antonio Olympio, he can barely recognize him. He almost looks like he was hit by a car or something, because Antonio Olympio's physical appearance is almost unrecognizable. And Antonio Olympio, when he arrives in the Mansion of Peace, he's not in good shape, but at the same time, he's different from the other spirits outside of the Mansion of Peace, because Antonio Olympio is finally ready to admit what he did that brought him to this state that he's in the first place. And Antonio's story is basically this. He lived in Brazil, and he, along with his two brothers, inherited a very large amount of land, a ranch, a big lake on it, and the land, in Antonio Olympio's opinion, had a great potential to make a lot of money. He saw big profit motives, but his two brothers weren't interested in that. One of them was an artist and really kind of wasn't that interested in commerce. And this drove Antonio Olympio up the wall. He really, really, really wanted to engage in making money. And this became an obsession of his. And then he finally is figuring out, what can I do to get this for myself? And then he admits that he convinced himself that I could only be happy if I killed my brothers. So one day he says to his two brothers, let's go out on this big lake of ours and check it out, survey it, because we haven't really been out there. And before they go out, he slips tranquilizers to his two brothers. So when the three of them are out on a boat in the middle of this lake, the tranquilizers have taken their full effect on his two brothers. That is when Antonio Olympio topples the boat and the three of them plunge into the water. Antonio Olympio does nothing. He can hear his two brothers screaming for help, pleading for help in their lives. And he hangs onto the boat and waits until both of them drown. The minute they drown, he starts to feel a little guilty. But Antonio is able to compartmentalize his feelings, and so what he does is that he swims back to shore. He convinces the authorities that there was an accident. He's believed, and he and his wife, Alzira, wind up with all of the land for themselves. And he becomes a prominent citizen in the area, both of them do. And their son, Luis, is born. Meanwhile, Antonio's two disincarnated brothers are furious at him, and they become his enemies, and they are determined to get their revenge no matter how. They become very skillful obsessors, and they go after Antonio, his wife Alzira, and their son Luis. A few years when Luis, their son, is roughly 12 years old, Alzira starts having intense fevers and becomes very sick. And the brothers start working on her. They start obsessing her to the point that she becomes delirious. And one day she throws herself into the same lake where they drowned. Antonio, now a widower, goes on and yet has this feeling that maybe his brothers are around him. He always feels a little troubled by this, but he manages to kind of keep going. And eventually, when he passes, his two brothers are waiting for him. And in the spirit world, they torment him. They beat him up. They make him feel as guilty as possible. They reinforce that feeling he always had inside of him, that feeling of guilt he had about killing his two brothers. And they really take advantage of that. Then what happens is they put him in a cave. And Antonio stays kind of entrapped in his own cycle of thought, as many of the other spirits in the lower zones are. Well, eventually, Alzira, his deceased wife, was received into the Mansion of Peace, and she helps Antonio. And eventually he gets rescued. And so when he is brought into the Mansion of Peace, his story and the situation that they're all facing is an example of how he, his wife Alzira, and their son Luis, they all became vulnerable because of the way they allowed their thoughts to create the environments that they currently exist. It was Alzira, as I mentioned before, who was able to break out of this. Their son Luis, who's still alive, still running the property, has become very miserly. Because of that, his two deceased uncles, who want revenge on him, as well as his father and his wife, they surround him. They're with him all the time. They bring in miser spirits, and Luis starts to kind of deteriorate emotionally. And so Silas, the assistant to Druso, is brought in to try to help this family at the request of Alzira. And Andre and Ilario accompany him. And as I mentioned before, when Andre sees Luis for the first time, he says he looks really disfigured. And what it is that there's been a lot of trauma to his paraspirit. So I'm just going to ask a basic question, or take a moment and focus on what is the paraspirit. Well, we have the body, we have the soul, and then the link between the body and soul is the paraspirit. And in the Spirit's book, question 135, it describes the paraspirit as the intermediary principle, or paraspirit, which is a semi-material substance. It is the innermost envelope of the spirit and unites the soul with the body. And so our actions, our thoughts, and our intentions can have an effect on the paraspirit. And in the case of Antonio Olympio, because of the obsession from his brothers, because of what he did in the first place, he kept marking his paraspirit. And he now will have to go through the consequences of working out those effects on his paraspirit. He has to, if you could put it this way, he has to clean up his paraspirit a little bit. And that, of course, will take time, and it depends on in working for the good. By the way, I'm not going to say much more about the paraspirit, but if you're interested in this subject, Dr. Sonia Doi did a really nice presentation on this channel a few months earlier in this year on the subject of the paraspirit. Sillis also elaborates on what happens when thought has its effects on spirits. And he goes to say that, in fact, we aren't even close to understanding all of the creative and agglutinative power contained in person simple thought, and that is why we must do all we can to free human beings from all the disturbing expressions of their inner life. So he is touching on the subject that gets mentioned in the codification, that for spirits, thought is everything. And a large part of what this book, Action and Reaction, is about is the way in which our thoughts have a life of their own, and the way in which they can affect the state that a spirit is in the spirit world. So all these spirits outside the mansion of peace that are suffering, that, they're trapped within these obsessive compulsive thoughts. And Sillis elaborates a little further by saying that when we keep dwelling on these voices or darkness and the mental forces that we exteriorize, then return to our minds, and they kind of reanimate and they intensify by the elements we're in tune with. I mentioned that Action and Reaction was published in 1956, which was a time when television was becoming widely available. So they use the metaphor of television and the way in which an image that's generated through it by a camera can transmit that image to the screen. It happens almost instantaneously. And when that occurs, it is an example of how quickly thought travels and how thought can spread among spirits. But again, it's a major theme of this book. When Sillis is explaining this situation, this condition, he also goes on to say that consequently we reinforce the bars of the prison in which we thoughtlessly remain, making our soul a closed world, where the voices and images of our own thoughts combine with the suggestions of those who are in tune with our behavior, thereby imposing reoccurrent hallucinations on us and temporarily neutralizing our senses. So the more we keep having these obsessive compulsive thoughts, the more we create the bars of the prison. This is a major theme in the book Heaven and Hell, the fourth book in the codification that Allan Kardec put together, the Spiritist codification, is that we often create the environment that we live in. But there's also a hint in all of this that we do have free will and that we do have a say in this situation. Because I mentioned before that Druso says regarding all those spirits suffering outside the mansion of peace, rescue is only good for those that want to be rescued. So if people or individuals don't want to be rescued, that means they're using their free will. Maybe to some level they can't help it, but on some level they just don't want to really change either. And all of this is adding up to one of the major themes of the book of Action and Reaction, which is simply that our thoughts, our actions and thoughts and intentions attract energies of the same kind. And I've been focusing on how that can certainly be a path to entrapment, the way we entrap ourselves with our thoughts and our intentions. But we can also use our thoughts and our intentions and actions to be a source of liberation. And all of this is connected to the way in which there is a relationship between the subject of karma as it's understood in Hinduism and cause and effect as it's described in this book, Action and Reaction. I mentioned at the very beginning that when Andre and Ilario first show up at the Mansion of Peace, they are there to study, quote, karma of the Hindus. That's part of how they describe it. So they're very mindful about karma. I'm going to spend a little bit of time just focusing on karma through non-spiritist sources. And there's a really nice book, which I'm going to show you a little bit more of in a moment, on the World's Religions by Houston Smith. And there's this nice description he has about the process of reincarnation, because he's got a whole section on it, on Hinduism. And reincarnation is kind of like this. Spirits are like bubbles going through boiling water. In the very beginning, they emerge when spirits are in that primitive state that Spiritism talks about. And then as they move their way up through the boiling water, which can be a metaphor for the process of life, the process of moving through the universe, if you will, until eventually, as that bubble gets to the top of the boiling water, the expansion of the bubble is like an expansion of consciousness, or how Spiritism describes the process of becoming more of a pure spirit, whatever that means, because there are different degrees of what we, of different levels of progress. And there's a nice series of translations of the Indian scriptures, ancient Indian scriptures, by a person named Eknath Iswarian. He was a professor. For many years, he was a professor at UC Berkeley, taught one of the first classes on meditation, and he did this translation of the Bhagavad Gita, but he also wrote an introduction. And when he talks about karma, he says some of the following. He mentions that the Sanskrit karma means something that is done. Often it can be translated as a deed or action, and that the law of karma states simply that every event is both a cause and effect. And in the book on the World's Religions by Houston Smith, he picks up on this idea. And he says that science has alerted the West to the importance of causal relationships in the physical world. Every physical event, we are inclined to believe, has its cause, and every cause will have its determinate effects. So he's talking about classical physics. For every action, there is some kind of opposite reaction in terms of, like, imagine the way billiard balls travel around a billiard table. The angle which the ball will hit will go off at an angle opposite of that angle, and things like that. But Houston Smith goes a little further and points out that India extends this concept of causation to include moral and spiritual life as well. And then he goes on to give the example of an expression we're very familiar with. As a man sows, so shall he reap. And then he quotes a proverb. Some call it a Chinese proverb. It's probably not. And no one knows for sure who wrote this. Sometimes it's attributed to Ralph Waldo Emerson. But anyway, it goes like this. Sow a thought and reap an act. Sow an act and reap a habit. Sow a habit and reap a character. So a character can reap a destiny. And that this is how we in the West tend to understand some of the basic concepts of karma. But he says that the difference is that India tightens up and extends its concept of moral law to see it as absolute, but it brooks no exceptions. Now, he's also careful to say that karma is not fatalism. It's not that everything we go through, there's going to be some predetermined outcome. That's not the point at all. The point is that we have to answer for the things that we do. And in the book Action and Reaction, one of the major themes of that book is simply this: the debt must be paid off. Whatever the debt is that we incur, whatever we've done, we have to answer for it somehow. How we answer for it depends a lot. So again, karma is not fatalism. Eknath Iswarian goes on to point out the next step in all of this, which is that we are responsible for what happens to us, and whether or not we understand that responsibility or how we're responsible. And then he talks about the nature of free will. He says it follows that we can change what happens to us by changing ourselves, so we take our own destiny into our own hands. Again, the theme of responsibility is really important. And it's also one of the big themes in the book Action and Reaction. And Houston Smith picks up on this notion of responsibility as well in the World's Religions, and he says that we have complete, karma implies we have complete responsibility. And that sometimes people rebel against this idea. They don't like it very much. And they want to blame everyone. or blame, I don't know, we blame other people for this condition that we're in. We want to blame the system, the institution. And it's not that those things don't play a role in our current condition, but the more we want to blame someone or something outside of ourselves, the more we are copying on. And as it said here, Hindus see this attitude as being immature. And then he says, everybody gets exactly what is deserved. You know, this idea that we have made our own beds and must lie in them. Now that can sound a little heavy and a little punitive, for sure, but Eknath Iswarian, who picks up on that point, you know, the idea that we're getting our just desserts and all that. Well, okay, there's an element of truth to that, generally speaking. But he also points out, and this is very important, that it's more illuminating to think about karma as an educative force whose purpose is to teach the individual to act in harmony with Dharma. That is, not to pursue selfish interests at the expense of others, but to contribute to life and consider the welfare as a whole. In the Spirits book, of the law of progress, it points out that two of the biggest obstacles to progress is selfishness and pride. And so when we engage in those behaviors and we delay our own spiritual progress, we may be having to go through the consequences of having those attitudes, depending upon what we do. And as a result, when we go through the consequences of it, we can complain about it, and it may not be much fun to experience. But if we can finally pull back a little bit and see it as a source of education, then it's a lot more illuminating to appreciate. It's basically the idea of karma is that it's setting boundaries to our activities. We can't do anything we feel like. There are limits to what we can do. Joanna de Angelis, in her book Family Constellation, which is one study group I'm involved in right now, mentions, and it's a very brief, basic point, that the family is very much like a source of education when spirits incarnate into the same family. All the things that can occur in a family are major sources of education, one of the most important sources of education. So this idea that what we go through in life is a form of education is important as a way of thinking about it. And he also talks about being in harmony with Dharma. So what is Dharma? Well, I'll give you an example. There was a wise old sage on the Ganges River in India. And this wise old sage is looking into the water, and he sees a scorpion is drowning in the water. So he reaches in, picks up the scorpion, and the scorpion stings him. And he goes, ouch, and he drops the scorpion back into the water. And a little bit of time goes by, and he sees that poor scorpion is still drowning. So he reaches into the water again, picks up the scorpion, and once again the scorpion stings him. Someone observing this says to the sage, Master, the scorpion keeps stinging you. Why do you keep trying to rescue it? And the wise old sage says in reply, it is the Dharma of the scorpion to sting, it is the Dharma of the human being to rescue. So Dharma has to do with our intention. It has to do with our real deeper nature. Yes, human beings can be very self-centered, narcissistic, greedy, and a lot worse. But we're also very capable of compassion, fraternity, love, and so forth, charity. So what is our real nature? Well, what is our real nature as we progress? And so the whole point of reincarnation and going through karma is not only to learn, but to appreciate and understand over time that we have options and we do have another nature that goes beyond perhaps what we first thought our nature was. So for those who are cynical and think that humans are inherently selfish, the law of progress as it's described in the Spirits book says not so fast. We can be selfish for quite a while, but eventually it's going to catch up, and eventually we will start to move into a new phase in our spiritual progress. And again, as I've been saying, Eknath Iswarian emphasizes that your life is like a school. And as long as the debt of karma remains, then we keep coming back for that further education. And he describes this as the basis of samsara, the cycle of birth and death. In other words, reincarnation. So, in terms of the book Action and Reaction, I'm going to start to slowly wind up here. The way in which action and reaction ends is revealing. I mentioned to you before that Druso is the director of the Mansion of Peace, and his leading assistant is Silas. And Silas is the one who shows Andre and Ilario several cases. I don't begin to have time to describe all the other spirits that appear in this book. And one of the points that's made in observing these cases of spirits that are really going through somewhat heavy karma, as they say, is that it's easier to understand cause and effect when you're dealing with more extreme cases. In other words, the worst of the worst, if you will, who are then having to go through the consequences of that when they incarnate back into the physical world. And it depends on the individual. Sometimes it's not as bad as it may sound, but there are some that are having to go through a great deal, through either emotional difficulties, physical impairments, and so forth. The director of the Mansion of Peace, Druso, is a very hands-on kind of director. He's not sitting up in some Ivy League office bestowing his orders to the underlings who then do the work. No, he gets down in there in the trenches, as they say, and he helps the spirits when they come into this from the lower zones. He counsels them directly. He gets directly involved in the work. Druso is a very compassionate director. He's very wise. He's very generous with his time. And so is Silas. And Silas has a great deal of knowledge. Silas does a lot of good. Druso does a lot of good. And at the very end of the book, we get a plot revelation, which we did not know before. And it's simply this. We find out at the end of the book that Druso is Silas's father. And this is significant for a couple of reasons. When Silas helps Antonio Olympio, who I mentioned before, the large wealthy landowner who murdered his brothers, Silas does this by taking Andre and Ilario with him, and they go to visit Antonio Olympio's son, Luis, on that large ranch, and Silas gets to know the two brothers of Antonio Olympio, who are now very sophisticated obsessor spirits, very skillful ones. And Silas is very wise in the way he's going to try to reach these two. He obviously wants to change them, but he doesn't do this by simply lecturing them and saying, you really should stop obsessing your brother. This is not a good thing to do, and so forth. No. What Silas does is he first works with them. He makes them think that he too is an obsessor, and he and Andre and Ilario are there to join all the other miser spirits that surround Luis, and they're there to obsess him because they think he kind of deserves it. And then Silas talks a little bit about the process of obsession at one point, and he demonstrates to these two brothers how much he knows. And they begin to respect this guy. This guy comes across like he knows what he's doing. But then, a little later on in the book, Silas does something interesting. He starts to tell these two brothers, these skillful, angry obsessors, his own story. And what Silas tells them, in effect, is that he in his prior incarnation, Silas, as the son of Druso, they were wealthy. Druso was independently wealthy, trained to be a lawyer, didn't really practice law because he didn't have to work. And so, and Silas, really from a young age, was always pretty obsessed about earning money. And so Silas's mother, Druso's wife, is a very religious woman. And she's active in the church, and she wants her son and her husband to be involved in the church with her. And neither one of them are terribly interested. She tries and tries and tries, especially with Silas, to convince him, and it just doesn't work. Silas really is very materialistic in his attitude. Well, she passes away, Druso remarries to a young woman named Ida. Druso's second wife is about 30, roughly the same age as Silas, and Silas sees this young stepmother of his as a threat. She's going to wind up with his father's wealth, not him. So he starts to figure out what is he going to do about this. Maybe he could kill her. No, I'm not so sure he wants to do that. But then the opportunity presents itself. Silas one day meets a cousin of Ida, who is kind of a womanizing dandy type. And he's always been attracted to his cousin Ida. And he tried to court her a little bit before she married Druso. So Silas sees his opportunity. He makes sure that his stepmother Ida and her cousin spend as much time with each other as humanly possible. And this goes on for about a year. And then finally, Ida gives in to her desires toward her cousin, and they begin an affair. Silas immediately goes to his father because they're in, Ida and her cousin are in bed together in the same house as Druso. Silas goes to his father and says, "Do you know what's going on right now?" And his father, Druso, does not believe him. And Silas says, "Well, I'll show you." And so Druso discovers his second wife in bed with her cousin. He, of course, is upset. She is upset. She's humiliated. She's angry. Her cousin, again, a womanizer, opportunist, doesn't see Druso, this 60-year-old guy, as much of a threat. So he gets out of there fast. Ida, Druso's wife, retreats into her bedroom. 2 weeks later, she dies. Druso, who was not in great health to begin with, deteriorates. And then he's on the verge of death himself. Then he confesses to his son Silas. The reason Ida died only 2 weeks after I discovered her is because I poisoned her. I was poisoning her slowly. And obviously Druso felt very troubled by this, that he did this to him. Silas immediately goes, "Oh my God, what did I do?" He didn't like her. He saw her as a threat, but he didn't necessarily want her killed. And when he realizes that he wrecked his father's life and her life, obviously, in the marriage, then he starts to, he finally gets what he wants. He has the wealth of his father after Druso passes, but he's not happy with it. And then he goes off to Europe and he tries to forget about it. It doesn't work. He drinks a lot. He doesn't take good care of his health. And he goes back to Brazil and he's with a friend. He can't go back to that house where all of this occurred. And then one day, when his stomach is bothering him, he grabs some what he thinks is bicarbonate soda, turns out to be poison, and he dies the same way that his stepmother did. People think he committed suicide, but it was an accident. Well, Silas is explaining all this to the two brothers of Antonio Olympio, and they start to think, what are we doing? And so there are consequences to this approach. But also, in explaining all this, Silas is revealing to us that he and his father have their own karma to work out. And then at the very end of the book, what happens is that because, after they suffered in the lower zones, they go into the Mansion of Peace, they get a lot of help, and then they start really are determined to help themselves. So both Druso and Silas make a lot of progress in the spiritual world. And then they incarnate, or they elevate not incarnate, they elevate in their positions that there are as director and lead assistant, if you will. At the very end of the book, a spirit arrives, and it turns out to be the spirit of Ida, Druso's second wife, and they are overjoyed to finally be reunited with him. Silas mentions when he's describing his backstory that he hopes one day to reconnect with his stepmother. And so once this occurs, Druso, Silas, Ida, and Druso's first wife can all begin the process of going back into the physical world and reincarnating as a new family. And the plan is essentially this. Druso is going to go first. He will eventually meet his first wife again. They'll remarry again. And then later on, both Silas and Ida, who were stepson and stepmother are now going to be brother and sister. And that allows this family the opportunity to then reconnect with one another and work out the problems that they had with one another in the past. What's encouraging is that a lot of work was done in the spirit world, especially with Druso and Silas, so they have a very good chance of making progress in the physical world when that time comes. The way in which we discover all this revelation about Druso, I just want to end with an important point. The director of the Mansion of Peace, Druso, is not some high-level spirit who's been in the higher realms for centuries and he happens to be working at this mansion. He is a guy who murdered his own wife in his last incarnation. He is not a saint. He cares about these people, he cares about these spirits that suffer, and so do Silas. But neither Druso nor Silas are saints themselves, despite all the progress they've made. And they've made a lot of genuine progress. And that's important to keep in mind. So in a way, the Mansion of Peace is kind of set up like Alcoholics Anonymous. Because Alcoholics Anonymous is an organization designed to help people who are struggling with alcoholism to go into a program of recovery. But it's revealing that Alcoholics Anonymous is run by people who are alcoholics themselves. Because they have, not only they have the compassion of what it's like to be in that situation, they've been there themselves. And Druso and Silas have a lot of compassion for these suffering spirits because they've been there themselves. And so the Mansion of Peace is structured this way, and it serves a purpose that way. And I just want to wrap up by sharing a thought about the way in which when we make the effort to try to turn things around in our lives, that there's a wonderful way in which that reverberates and resonates. And this is a quote from the Siddhartha Upanishad. Those who act without thought of personal profit and lead a well-disciplined life discover in course of time the divine principle that all forms of life are one. They work in the service of the Lord and are free from the law of karma. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Wonderful lecture. So much for us to learn here, right?
Yes.
And I think that...
I hope it was okay.
Yeah. So we have some questions brought through our chat. So first one, can you explain the surroundings of where Mansion of Peace and similar institutions are located in the spiritual world?
Okay, that's a good question. Thank you for that question. The Mansion of Peace is surrounded in a part of the lower zones that are made up of spirits that are very disturbed. So there's a lot of suffering going on. It's dark all the time in this area where the Mansion of Peace is, because it's a reflection of the collective environment that's been made up by the spirits who are in it. So if you are familiar with the book Memories of a Suicide, it describes a place that's kind of similar. It's like almost like a fortress, a place where spirits that have committed suicide go, because what we've been told is that spirits that commit suicide go through a particular part of the spirit world where they then have to go through the consequences of what they do. And yet the institution that the spirits go to in this book, Memories of a Suicide, as it's described to us, is another area of the spirit world that is a place of refuge for them. And in this book, Action and Reaction, I didn't have time to get into a minister named Minister Sanzio, who comes into, it's like around chapter 6 and 7 or so of Action and Reaction. And he's there to help approve the process of reincarnations, recommendations made by Druso and the others at the Mansion of Peace. And Andre and Ilario have some time with Minister Sanzo privately, and they get to ask this high-level spirit about the nature of karma. And one of the points that Sanzo makes is that the whole process of karma has a lot to do with a certain organization. And the way in which these Mansion of Peace is set up and other institutions like it are set up is that it's part of, quote, God's organization. Meaning, in order for the process of carnation to work at all, you need to have this kind of institutional structure. So there are places like that in the lower zones that help to be, as it were, a place of refuge, a halfway house, if you will. It's equivalent to, I mentioned Alcoholics Anonymous as one example, any place that can be a place of recovery for people. It's not an accident that in No Solar, parts of No Solar are a working hospital. They're receiving spirits that come in from the lower zones to try to help them.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, it's always interesting when we talk about these transitory houses of assistance, as they are called, right? Generates a lot of questions also, right. You know, where they are located, why they are located there, and you'll see that throughout the books, right? Of André Luiz.
You know, if you look at No Solar and you think, God, it's a little strange. It's a city. You have all these administrative departments. Why? Well, there's a lot of organization in the spirit world, is what we've been told. This is one of the big things that the André Luiz books tell us.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay, next one. Can you talk about free will and karma and how do they relate?
Well, when people talk about free will, if we think that we have total free will, that's not really true. It's about, we don't have total free will, but we're not robots either. So when we talk about free will, we are talking about trying to operate within certain boundaries that have been established in the first place. Karma are those boundaries. Karma is, you know, what, as I mentioned before, one of the big themes of the book Action and Reaction, and one of the big points about karma, is that whatever we do, whatever we think, a lot of times we have to live with the consequences of that further down the road. But that doesn't mean I'm destined to go through this particular experience. I have no choice. Well, maybe on some level we have to go through that experience. But how we experience it, we have a say in that. If I fight everything constantly, and I complain constantly, and I resist constantly, it's going to be harder. If I learn how to resign myself and to be more at peace with where I am, then it's easier. But when I resign myself, I'm not being passive, and I'm not being apathetic, and I'm because karma implies work. That's another way of understanding action, work. We have to make the active effort to work on our spiritual progress. How quickly we progress, well, it depends on a lot of things. To some extent, it depends on us. To some extent, it depends on how long it takes for a situation to work itself out. What do I mean by that? Our actions and the consequences of our actions are a little bit like cutting our finger. Say we cut our finger. Well, you got to put the Band-Aid on, and it takes a certain amount of time for it to heal. But if I don't put any Neosporin or some kind of ointment on it, and I don't bother with the Band-Aid, and it gets infected, I used my free will to make it worse. But if I put on that Neosporin or some other ointment, and I put on the Band-Aid and I wash it and I take care of it, chances are, if I heal normally, it won't be so bad and it'll heal in a couple of days or whatever. At least get the bleeding to stop. So this is kind of an example of how the interaction of karma and free will can work. You've got to go through the process, but we use our free will to navigate how we facilitate that process.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, always important to stress, you know, that both exist and are connected. So from Luis Leão,
Mm-hmm.
It is mentioned in the book that Alzira, mother of Luis, had a lot of difficulty providing support to him and his grandchildren. Why?
She had to try and thank you, Louise, for that question. When she goes into the spirit world, she's the one that gets reached first. She's the one that first arrived at the mansion of peace. And she wants to help her family. But as Druso says, rescue only works for those who want to be rescued. So Druso was in a place where he was so distraught over his own feelings that it was difficult for him to be reached. And the same thing with Louise, her son, in that she wants to help him, but he's so preoccupied with making money and so forth, and figuring out how am I going to get the land that belongs to my neighbor so I can increase my land holdings. When people get in those mindsets, we can pray for them. We should pray for them. We should try to help them as much as we can. But at some point, they have to also get the message themselves. And so sometimes it takes time. And therefore, Alzira, in providing for him in this sense, it's like she's trying to help him so that he can then begin to help himself. But when people don't open themselves up to receiving assistance, then it can be a one-way street for a while. But then eventually, with persistence, people start to change.
Thanks. Yeah, interesting. So, in the book, the obsessor Leonel explained about a key mechanism for obsessing someone by saying, we more frequently emit the thoughts that originate in the central desire that characterizes us. Based on this, how do we manage our desires in order to avoid being spiritually obsessed?
Consciousness. The first step is to be aware of what our desires really are. So sometimes when we become more mindful of our tendencies, physical desires, for instance, then we start to put ourselves in a pathway where we can begin to ask ourselves, is this really that important? I was having this conversation recently about the effects of drinking, for instance. Suppose somebody likes to drink. Well, they may have that desire to have that drink, and they enjoy the buzz they get, if you will, and they enjoy the camaraderie with their friends, but then the next day they wake up with a hangover. That might be the indication that maybe this is not so much fun after all. And then how important is it really? But if we never confront that in any way, and we just sort of go on autopilot, where I really want that drink, I really want that drink. Yeah, it's a physical desire. It is to some extent a physical need, but it's also an emotional need. Sometimes people feel they're only more interesting when they drink. They feel differently, their perspective changes. But it's an illusion. And so what Lino is saying is, when people have physical desires and they don't pay attention to them at all, and they don't confront them in any way, or start to work on overcoming them, then they really open themselves up for obsession.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So we have another one. We clearly see André Luiz evolving through the books of the Spiritual World collection. How is that different or not from evolving in the physical world?
In the physical world, interacting with the physical world and all the challenges that come with the physical world get us to, in some ways, improve a little faster, because we have to just contend with all of the difficulties of being in the physical world, just getting from point A to point B, navigating the relationships that we have in our families, the way we move around the physical world, being in our bodies, the issues. Now, what kind of bodies do we have? Do we have healthy bodies? Do we think we're attractive? Do we think we're not attractive? Do we have all kinds of, what is our attitude towards ourselves in our bodies? It's just one example, it's just one part of it. Part of being here in the physical world is we have to learn how to be in our bodies. So it's, I think, a huge mistake if people think, oh, I'm a spiritist, I want to be in the spirit world all the time, and I don't want to be in my body. That's, I think, very misguided, because we should be in our bodies, we are in our bodies, and we need to learn what that means and how to navigate all the challenges that come with being in our bodies. So that's just one thing. In the spirit world, there's more time to reflect. There's, unfortunately, spirits will go through the consequences of their past behavior in the spirit world. But when we look at the Andre Louis books and we look at, say, the journey that Andre himself went on, Andre was in the lower zones in the book No Solar, first book of the series, certainly worth reading if you haven't. And then he finally has had enough of it, meaning he finally asks for help, and then he gets rescued. And then he goes through the learning process of being in No Solar, but a lot of it is a kind of mental process. But he's also doing work there too, and he has to make the adjustment of letting go of who he was in the physical world, because he was a doctor in the physical world, and he shows up at No Solar, and he's ready to take care of patients. I'm a doctor. No, he's not going to do that, but there is, this vomit over here that needs to be cleaned up. Could you please take care of that? And that's kind of a blow to him at first. But then he begins to understand that he's not who he was before. He doesn't have the same privileges as before. He's in a different place. And he has to make those emotional and mental adjustments. And this happens in other ways in that book too, like when he goes back to see his family. So the point is, to answer the question this way, it is the interaction between going from the physical world into the spirit world and going from the spirit world back into the physical world. That transition back and forth that we learn in both places. In some ways, though, because of the struggles of the physical world, we learn a little faster. But it doesn't mean we don't learn in the spiritual world, because a lot of progress can be made there too. It depends on the individual. Depends on consciousness, depends on how determined the spirit is to make progress. Druso and Silas in the book Action Reaction are examples of that. They understood that they really needed to work on doing goodness for goodness' sake and not have some hidden agenda. And the more they did that, the more it took on kind of a life of its own, and it helped them.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yeah, this is a question that is always asked in the study groups, right? The difference between evolving there and evolving here, and how can we evolve? All right, so that was our last question. Once again, Peter, thank you very much for this beautiful presentation. Before I invite you to do our final prayer, I just like to remind everyone that next week, next Saturday, July 3rd at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, we'll have our friend Yasko Arakawa talking about humility. Is it a helpful trait in present times? So don't miss this lecture next Saturday. We'll be here together again. Peter, can I ask you to do our final prayer? Thanks.
For those of us who are able to close our eyes at this moment, we're safe to do so. Please close our eyes, or else keep them open, and just please be with us in your thoughts. We thank you, dear God. We thank you, dear Jesus, and our dear mentors, for your support. We thank you for your presence. We thank you for all the ways in which we receive help and assistance. We thank you, dear Jesus, for your teachings. We thank our dear mentors for their guidance and their inspiration. We are thankful to have the opportunity to be inspired, and may we each and every day receive inspiration to the best of our ability, pay attention to that inspiration, and do our best to work in harmony with our higher selves. Please bless our families. Please bless our friends and our neighbors. May all of us see one another as brothers and sisters. May humanity as a whole work together in harmony with one another. Please bless all those who are suffering. May they receive help and assistance. And please bless those who help others, our healthcare workers, among others. May they all be blessed in their efforts, and may we collectively be generous with our hearts. Amen.
Thank you all. Thanks. See you next week.